Chapter 3. Barley of Rei. His son Hassan Sabah Hassan sent to study at Nishapur meets their Omar Khayyam and Nizam al-Mulk agreement made by them. Hassan introduced by Nizam to Sultan Malik Shah obliged to leave the court. Anecdote of him. His own account of his conversion: goes to Egypt, returns to Persia, makes himself master of Alamut. There was a man named Barley, who resided in the city of Rei, in Persia. He was a strenuous sheikh, and maintained that his family had originally come from Kufa, in Arabia, but the people of Khorasan asserted that his family had always dwelt in one of the villages near Tus, in that province, and that consequently his pretensions to an Arabian extraction were false. Barley, it would appear, was anxious to conceal his opinions, and employed the strongest asseverations to convince the governor of the province, the rigid Sunnite, of his orthodoxy, and finally retired into a monastery to pass the remainder of his days in meditation. As a further means of clearing himself from the charge of heresy, he sent his only son Hassan Sabah to Nishapur to be instructed by the celebrated Imam Moafek, who resided at that place. What lessons he may have given the young Hassan previously to parting with him, and what communication he may have afterwards kept up with him, are points on which history is silent. The fame of the Imam Moafek was great over all Persia, and it was currently believed that those who had the good fortune to study the Quran and the Sunnah under him were secured of their fortune in afterlife. His school was consequently thronged by youths ambitious of knowledge and future distinction, and here Hassan met, and formed a strict intimacy with Omar Khayyam, afterwards so distinguished as a poet and an astronomer, and with Nizam al-Mulk regulation of the realm, who became vizier to the monarchs of the house of Seljuk. This last, in a history which he wrote of himself and his times, relates the following instance of the early development of the ambition of Hassan. As these three, who were the most distinguished pupils of the Imam, were one day together, it is the general opinion, said Hassan, that the pupils of the Imam are certain of being fortunate. This opinion may be verified in one of us. So come, let us pledge ourselves to one another that he who shall be successful will make the other to sharers in his good fortune. His two companions readily assented, and the promise was mutually given and received. Nizam al-Mulk entered the path of politics, where his talents and his noble qualities had free course, and he rose through the various gradations of office, till at length he attained the highest post in the realm, the viziriate, under Alparslan Strong Lion, the second monarch of the house of Seljuk. When thus exalted he forgot not his former friends, and calling to mind the promise which he had made, he received with great kindness Omar Khayyam, who waited on him to congratulate him on his elevation, and he offered at once to employ all his interest to procure him a post under the government. But Omar, who was devoted to Epicurean indulgences, and averse from toil and care, thanking his friend, declined his proffered services, and all that the vizier could prevail on him to accept was an annual pension of 1,200 ducats on the revenues of Nishapur, whither he retired to spend his days in ease and tranquility. The case was different with Hassan. During the 10 years' reign of Alparslan he kept aloof from the vizier, living in obscurity, and probably maturing his plans for the future. But when the young Prince Malik Shah King mounted the throne, he saw that his time was come. He suddenly appeared at the court of the new monarch, and waited on the powerful vizier. The story is thus told by the vizier himself in his work entitled Wasair Political Institutes, whence it is given by Merkhunt. He came to me at Nishapur in the year that Malik Shah, having got rid of Koward, had quieted the troubles which his rebellion had caused. I received him with the greatest honors, and performed, on my part, all that could be expected from a man who is a faithful observer of his oaths, and a slave to the engagements which he has contracted. Each day I gave him a new proof of my friendship, and I endeavored to satisfy his desires. He said to me once, "Khaja Master, you are of the number of the learned and the virtuous. You know that the goods of this world are but an enjoyment of little duration. Do you then think that you will be permitted to fail in your engagements by letting yourself be seduced by the attractions of greatness and the love of the world? And will you be of the number of those who violate the contract made with God? Heaven keep me from it." Replied I, "Though you heap honors upon me," continued he, "and though you pour upon me benefits without number, you cannot be ignorant that that is not the way to perform what we once pledged ourselves to respecting each other." "You are right," said I, "and I am ready to satisfy you in what I promised. All that I possess of honor and power, received from my fathers or acquired by myself, belongs to you in common with me. I then introduced him into the society of the Sultan, I assigned him a rank and suitable titles, and I related to the prince all that had formerly passed between him and me. I spoke in terms of such praise of the extent of his knowledge, of his excellent qualities, and his good morals, that he obtained the rank of minister and of a confidential man. But he was, like his father, an impostor, a hypocrite, one who knew how to impose, and a wretch. He so well possessed the art of covering himself with an exterior of probity and virtue that in a little time he completely gained the mind of the Sultan, and inspired him with such confidence that that prince blindly followed his advice in most of those affairs of a greater and more important nature which required good faith and sincerity, and he was always decided by his opinion. I have said all this to let it be seen that it was I who had raised him to this fortune, and yet, by an effect of his bad character, there came quarrels between the Sultan and me, the unpleasant result of which had like to have been that the good reputation and favor which I had enjoyed for so many years were near going into dust and being annihilated, for at last his malignity broke out on a sudden, and the effects of his jealousy showed themselves in the most terrible manner in his actions and in his words. In fact, Hassan played the part of a treacherous friend. Everything that occurred in the divan was carefully reported to the Sultan, and the worst construction put upon it, and hints of the incapacity and dishonesty of the vizier were thrown out on the fitting occasions. The vizier himself has left us an account of what he considered the worst trick which his old schoolfellow attempted to play him. The Sultan, it seems, wishing to see a clear and regular balance sheet of the revenues and expenditure of his empire, directed Nizam al-Mulk to prepare it. The vizier required a space of more than a year for the accomplishment of the task. Hassan deemed this a good opportunity for distinguishing himself, and boldly offered to do what the Sultan demanded in 40 days, not more than 1/10 of the time required by the vizier. All the clerks in the finance department were immediately placed at the disposal of Hassan, and the vizier himself confesses that at the end of the 40 days the accounts were ready to be laid before the Sultan. But, just when we might expect to see Hassan in triumph, and enjoying the highest favor of the monarch, we find him leaving the court in disgrace and vowing revenge on the Sultan and his minister. This circumstance is left unexplained by the ornament of the realm, who however acknowledges, with great naivete, that, if Hassan had not been obliged to fly, he should have left the court himself. But other historians inform us that the vizier, apprehensive of the consequences, had recourse to art, and contrived to have some of Hassan's papers stolen, so that, when the latter presented himself before the Sultan, full of hope and pride, and commenced his statement, he found himself obliged to stop, for want of some of his most important documents. As he could not account for this confusion, the Sultan became enraged at the apparent attempt to deceive him, and Hassan was forthwith obliged to retire from court with precipitation. Nizam al-Mulk determined to keep no measures with a man who had thus sought his ruin, and he resolved to destroy him. Hassan fled to Ardi, but, not thinking himself safe there, he went further south, and took refuge with his friend the Rais Baby el-Faso, father of excellence, at Isfahan. What his plans may have hitherto been is uncertain, but now they seem to have assumed a definite form, and he unceasingly meditated on the means of avenging himself on the Sultan and his minister. In consultation one day with Abu el-Faso, who appears to have adopted his speculative tenets, after he had poured out his complaints against the vizier and his master, he concluded by passionately saying, "Oh, that I had but two faithful friends at my devotion! Soon should I overthrow the Turk and the peasant," meaning the Sultan and the vizier. Abu el-Faso, who was one of the most clear-headed men of his time, and who still did not comprehend the long-sighted views of Hassan, began to fancy that disappointment had deranged the intellect of his friend, and, believing that reasoning would in such a case be useless, commenced giving him at his meals aromatic drinks and dishes prepared with saffron, in order to relieve his brain. Hassan perceived what his kind host was about, and resolved to leave him. Abu el-Faso in vain employed all his eloquence to induce him to prolong his visit. Hassan departed, and shortly afterwards set out for Egypt. 20 years afterwards, when Hassan had accomplished all he had projected, when the Sultan and the vizier were both dead, and the society of the assassins was fully organized, the Rais Abu el-Faso, who was one of his most zealous partisans, visited him at his hill fort of Alamut. "Well, Grace," said Hassan. Paragraph continues. "Which of us was the madman? Did you or I stand most in need of the aromatic drinks and the dishes prepared with saffron which you used to have served up at Isfahan? You see that I kept my word as soon as I had found two trusty friends." When Hassan left Isfahan, in the year 1078, the Caliph Mostanzar, a man of some energy, occupied the throne of Egypt, and considerable exertions were made by the missionaries of the Society at Cairo to gain proselytes throughout Asia. Among these proselytes was Hassan Salber, and the following account of his conversion, which has fortunately been preserved in his own words, is interesting, as affording a proof that, like Cromwell, and, as we have supposed, Mohammed, and all who have attained to temporal power by means of religion, he commenced in sincerity, and was deceived himself before he deceived others. "From my childhood," says he, "even from the age of 7 years, my sole endeavor was to acquire knowledge and capacity. I had been reared up, like my fathers, in the doctrine of the 12 Imams, and I made acquaintance with an Ismailite companion Rafik, named Amir Durab, with whom I knit fast the bonds of friendship. My opinion was that the tenets of the Ismailites resembled those of the philosophers, and that the ruler of Egypt was a man who was initiated in them. As often, therefore, as Amir said anything in favor of these doctrines I fell into strife with him, and many controversies on points of faith ensued between him and me. I gave not in to anything that Amir said in disparagement of our sect, though it left a strong impression on my mind. Meanwhile Amir parted from me, and I fell into a severe fit of sickness, during which I reproached myself, saying, that the doctrine of the Ismailites was assuredly the true one, and that yet out of obstinacy I had not gone over to it, and that, should death, which God avert, overtake me, I should die without having attained to the truth. At length I recovered of that sickness, and I now met with another Ismailite, named Abidu Nejam Zara, of whom I inquired touching the truth of his doctrine. Abidu Nejam explained it to me in the fullest manner, so that I saw quite through the depths of it. Finally I met a Dai, named Mu'min, to whom the Sheikh Abd al-Malik, servant of the king, i.e. of God Ben Attash, the director of the missions of Iraq, had given permission to exercise this office. I besought that he would accept my homage in the name of the Fatimite Caliph, but this he at the first refused to do, because I had been in higher dignities than he, but when I pressed him thereto beyond all measure, he yielded his consent. When now the Sheikh Abd al-Malik came to Rdi, and through intercourse learned to know me, my behavior was pleasing unto him, and he bestowed on me the office of a Dai. He said unto me, Thou must go unto Egypt, to be a sharer in the felicity of serving the Imam Mostanzar. When the Sheikh Abd al-Malik went from Rei to Isfahan, I set forth for Egypt. There is something highly interesting in this account of his thoughts and feelings given by Hassan Salber, particularly when we recollect that this was the man who afterwards organized the Society of the Assassins, so long the scourge of the East. We here find him, according to his own statement, dreading the idea of dying without having openly made profession of the truth.